awful things. So, Mr. Wohl, let's talk about that behavior and how that undermines the faith of Tennesseans and all Americans in our public institutions, because they could see what was happening, but they were being lied to by people in the White House who were probably then running in their office and saying, well, we pulled it off another day.
Yeah, Senator, I mean, this is a theme you've talked about for many years, which is the executive branch is enormous. I mean, there are close to 1,000 employees in the executive office of the president. There are nearly 4 million full-time federal employees throughout the 14 departments that the president oversees. Executive power as accountable to the people of this country really manifests in two ways. The power of the president to remove bureaucrats and to fire them, and to affix his signature to official actions that he undertakes. So when the Washington establishment says something to the effect of, well, democracy dies in darkness, yes, it does when there are staffers, the media, cabinet officials, senior advisors to the president who all create a covering sort of shroud of darkness that obscures who is actually making the decisions. And one other thing I'll just say very quickly, a number of your colleagues on the Democrat side have said, well, there's an OLC opinion here. We don't need to talk anymore. There's an OLC opinion. It says you can use the auto pen. The opening paragraph of that OLC opinion says you can use the auto pen, but only when the president directs that you do so under his decision-making power, right? It is very clear again and again that the president actually has to make the decision. That cannot be delegated to a staffer or an advisor. And there's no indication here that anyone other than staff were making these decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all the witnesses for being here. You know, the visual, sometimes it really is true. A picture speaks louder than words. It's worth 1,000 words. And here, all you have to do is look over at this side of the dais to see that the stone wall continues. I mean, from the party that lied to this nation for 4 years, let's just take a look at some of the things that our colleagues said on the Democrat side when their own Justice Department was concluding that Joe Biden, who, let's not forget, illegally took classified documents and kept them in his garage, in his freezer. I mean, Lord knows where. He just certainly didn't know. Their own Justice Department interviewed the guy and concluded he could not form the requisite mental state to stand trial. He did not have the mental ability to stand trial. And what did our Democrat colleagues say? Vice President Harris says, oh, no, the way that the Hur report characterized the president is so wrong. The president's demeanor is totally fine. Senator Smith, what the Hur said about the president not remembering his son's death, so unfair. Senator Kaine said this is grandstanding. Senator Fetterman said it's just cheap shots. You had other senators saying, Senator Ossoff in February of 2024, saying, and I quote, I found the president to be sharp, focused, impressive, formidable, and effective. In June 2024, Congressman Jeffries insists Biden was, and I'm quoting again, incredibly strong, forceful, and decisive. Where are they now? They don't want to answer for any of those quotes now. They lied to us for 4 years, and we know they lied. They know they lied. It's why they're not here. They don't want to answer a single question. They can't bear to show their faces in public. And you know what? It's right that they can't do that, because the bill of goods they sold this country, they walked this country right into one of the greatest constitutional crises of our history, And now they are afraid to even show up to admit it. These are people, and this is a party that cannot be trusted with power, that cannot be trusted to tell the truth, the most basic truth. They all changed their tunes after Joe Biden debated President Trump, and the whole world could see he couldn't even form a sentence, that running this guy for president again is a form of elder abuse. My, how they changed their tunes after that. Now they can't even show up in public to talk about it. This is embarrassing. But worse than that, it's dangerous. It is dangerous for this country. Mr. Wold, I want to pick up on something you just said a second ago about the OLC and their opinion as to when an auto pen can be used. Just be clear about this. Auto pen means not signed by the person. Auto pen is basically push of a button and it gets signed. OLC says only when the president specifically directs it and it is under his direct authority. Do I basically have that right?
That's correct, Senator.
So based on the facts we know, did that happen in this case with all of the pardons and clemencies and other giveaways that Joe Biden signed?
Assuming that the Biden White House complied with sort of traditional practice of presidential administrations and that there was record keeping either from the staff secretary or others, there should be records to indicate either through covering memorandum or briefing books where the president would have signed his signature authorizing this decision. None of that has come forward. That would be very easy to dispel some of these concerns. And I think what we're seeing here is really the auto pen is best understood as a sort of a tool of executive convenience.
Hold on just a second. I just want you just said something very important. I want to emphasize that. So what you're saying is that there should be, for every time that Biden authorized the auto pen, there should be a record of that. And he should have had to have registered his personal consent to using the auto pen. Is that basically correct?
I think to put it another way, I would say in the policy paper flow to the Oval Office, there should be a record of what documents are presented to the president when he gave his assent to the actions that are listed in those documents, whether it's a judicial nomination or it's a statutory response to Congress.
Well, I think the answer is we need to get those documents. And I just say to our friends in the media over here, you guys need to be asking for those documents, and we need to be asking for them, Mr. Chairman. We need to see those documents. And the president, the former president now, can certainly choose to release them. I'm sure they're part of his personal papers, right, Mr. Wold?
And that's correct. And the first place to start would be the staff secretary's office under President Biden.
Oh, so here's the trail. If you want to know, if you want an answer to the question, did Joe Biden actually assent to the use of the auto pen and you think of all the people he pardoned, he granted clemency to, murderers, drug dealers, child rapists. Let's find out, did he actually authorize it? There should be a record of it, is what we've learned today. Thank you for that testimony, Mr. Wold. There should be a record of it. So this is a binary question. It's not, oh, we don't know, gee, it's hard to say. No, actually, we can find out. So right now, today, I call on President Biden, former President Biden and his staff, release the documents. You have them, you know you have them, release them. If what you did is legal, and if you're really not embarrassed about it, and you think it was totally constitutional, release the paper flow. Show us the documents where the president authorized the use of the pen for every single pardon and clemency and stay application. Let's see it. Let's see all of it. And if you won't do it, we should subpoena those documents, and we should find out the truth of who was really running the White House, because I think we can see it was not Joe Biden. Thank you all for being here today. Mr. Wold, thanks for your testimony.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I want to try to separate policy and politics for a second. I know it's hard to do around this place, but I thought Senator Cornyn made a very good point in his opening remarks. I think Senator Schmidt made the same point that the policy here is very important. And I want to ask you your opinion on the policy. Professor, tell me briefly, I know you came to talk about auto pens, but tell me briefly about the 25th Amendment.
Well, Senator, the 25th Amendment provides the process by which to implement a principle that's in the original Constitution, which is when the president's unable to exercise the powers and duties of the presidency, somebody else exercises them, starting with the vice president. The 25th Amendment sets up a process by which, if there's a question whether the president is able to do that, the vice president and the heads of the executive departments can temporarily basically put the vice president in as acting president, and then Congress ultimately decides the question.
Well, the standard, is it not, Professor? The standard is disability of the president. Is that correct?
Unable to exercise the powers and duties.
Okay.
Yes.
Here's what I would like your opinion on, and the opinion of these two gentlemen here. You have all been staffers. You've worked in government. You've had a boss. In Mr. Spicer's case, his boss was the President of the United States. Let's suppose the President, you were using your experience as a staffer. You were working for the President, any President, hypothetically a President. And let's suppose the President started talking like he was from outer space. Let's suppose the President became fatigued very easily. He couldn't finish a sentence without taking a nap. Let's suppose the president, he was just physically in bad shape, mentally and physically. Mentally, he may or may not have, you're not a doctor, neurodegenerative disease, but physically you can see you could bake a Thanksgiving turkey in the time it takes him to walk across the stage. What do you think, as a member of his staff, what do you think is your moral obligation to say, wait a minute, the president can't do the job anymore? I know you're loyal folks. You believe in your president, this president, whichever president. I'm speaking hypothetically. You're loyal. You want to be a good staffer, but you also have a moral obligation. How do you reach that decision, Professor? And I'll go to each of you.
Senator, I think the first thing you would have to do in a situation like that is exercise your own judgment. How serious is this problem? Because everybody has moments when they lose focus, it happens. But if somebody thinks this is a really serious problem, I think the first thing to do is the most difficult, which is to say to the president, because the 25th Amendment also provides that the president can say, I'm unable to exercise the powers and duties of my office.
And suppose the president
That would be extremely
says,
difficult, but I think it should be
look,
done.
trust me, I can. And it's clear to you that he has neurodegenerative disease and he can't. What do? Do you have a moral obligation as a staff member to go to the American people and say, we've got a problem here, it may cost me my career?
Senator, I think at that point you have an obligation to talk to the vice president, who is in charge of the Section 4 process under the 25th Amendment.
What about you, Mr. Wald? You have a moral obligation. I understand you want it to go away, you want to work it out with him, but you can't. When does a staffer have a moral obligation to stand up and say he can't be president anymore, she can't be?
Well, Senator, the 25th Amendment only works if individual staffers or officers of the United States exercise that kind of moral judgment.
That's what I'm asking you.
Yeah, so, I think always, as the professor said, the presidency is an enormous burden, so it would be not one instance, it would have to be several instances of a failure to exercise judgment.
How do you make that decision? You're the staffer, I get it.
Yeah, well, I think it begins with prayer, of course, but after that, I think it's conversation with other staffers, and if you're unable to confront the president or to raise the issue with the vice president, you should resign.
What about you, Mr. Spicer? Do you stand up and do it and tell the truth and run, or do you have a greater obligation to your boss?
Well, luckily I didn't have that problem, but I would say that you have a moral obligation as an American, as a citizen, as a human being. If the leader of the free world cannot conduct themselves to make the decisions that are critical to this country and to the world, you absolutely have a moral obligation to follow the chain of command, and if they don't act, then you must.
Do either of you gentlemen disagree with that? Professor?
Senator, I think acting means talking to the people who have the responsibility or in a position under the Constitution to do something.
You don't
about the
agree with
situation.
Mr. Spicer?
Senator, I'm not sure exactly what he has in mind, other than talking to the people who can make the decision.
I'm just trying to ask. So you've all been staffers. Suppose you go to everybody you're supposed to go to, and they all say, "My advice to you is to shut up." Do you have a moral obligation as a staffer to say, look, this person can't be president of the United States. It isn't policy. He physically can't do it.
Senator Kennedy, it's not a question of whether a staffer has that obligation. It's whether you as an American have that obligation, and I think each and every one of us does.
Yeah, but you can see it. An American can't. Professor, what do you think?
Senator, I think there are situations under which someone in that position should speak publicly, but I also think that the views of a single individual who is not the person who is constitutionally responsible for taking measures should be considered by the public as just the views of of one individual who has some information about the subject.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. I actually, the fact that this is in the past kind of reminds me of that scene in Lion King where Rafiki, the android, hit Simba on the head and said, "Doesn't matter, it's in the past." I hear, I could see where my Democrat colleagues would like to use that argument, but it mattered. And for me, I met President Biden as Vice President Biden when I was sworn in. He literally sworn me in 2015, and I've had several interactions with him over the years. There's no question that there was a significant degradation in his cognitive abilities. Probably the last time I spent much time with him was at a NATO summit. And I do think there are a lot of legitimate questions to be asked about who may have been tending the store, and I believe we should get to the bottom of it. But I want to look to the future. And back when this discussion was going on, I was suggesting the 25th Amendment. We know what the 25th Amendment does. Professor, I'm kind of curious about why, and with due respect to my colleague from Louisiana, this is a hell of a burden to place on a staff. Mr. Spicer, you've been in the White House. Can you imagine how heavy that would be and how unlikely it would be for you to be successful as an individual staff member? But Professor Harrison, I'm thinking more along the lines of what you see in boardrooms all the time about annual evaluations of the CEO or board members. What about the concept of something short of triggering the 25th Amendment, where the cabinet members, hand-selected members of the president, confirmed by the Senate, maybe on an annual basis, have to have an attestation that based on their work with the President of the United States, that he is mentally capable, fit, and the same way that we have boards make those decisions about board directors and CEOs. What would be wrong with some sort of a report or attestation to Congress from the cabinet member saying this man or woman is good to go, and it would be it would be perjury to Congress if they ended up covering up and history proved that. What's wrong with something like that as we're looking forward?
Senator, I would be, and maybe I am sort of being unduly protective of the independence of the other two branches, but
well, that's sort of why I want to leave it in the. That's why all I want is the cabinet to truthfully attest to the fact that their boss is of sound mind and body, and unless they lie, it's not an issue.
Senator,
it's an Article 2 responsibility to report to Congress like so many other things. What's wrong with that?
I think it would be a very good idea for the president to create a process like that. My concern is the thought of Congress making such a process mandatory, especially in light.
Well, I'm trying to figure out the consequence, because arguably, I find it hard to believe that there were members of the cabinet that didn't go, you know what, we love this guy, he appointed us to this position, but he's missing a step. And they're refusing to. This is not about any one person. This is about 340 million people in this country. No one of us should think that we should somehow be given a break if we're missing a step. So all I'm saying is you got to report honestly to Congress that the President of the United States, in your opinion, is absolutely demonstrated sound mind and body. It's like no other testimony. It'd be no different than us having them before the committee and say, is the boss okay? And if they lied, they'd be perjuring themselves. So what's the difference between that and some sort of a pro forma report that I'd be willing to subject the current president to, and then we'd have it for all the future presidents? What would be wrong with that?
Senator, again, I think the problem there is the Constitution has created a process for that, and that's the 25th Amendment, and that suggests that Congress can't create another process. Now, I do think that the point you're making today is part of the political process that might lead presidents to create a system like that on their own, which might enhance the people's confidence.
About to run out of time. Mr. Spicer, what do you think?
Senator, the president normally goes under a routine physical every year. In the case of President Biden, it was Dr. O'Connor who affirmatively stated his fitness for office. The doctor is probably the most competent person to attest to the president's fitness for office. the doctor should be held accountable for stating in the affirmative that President Biden was fit for office.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Biden administration may go down in history as the most brazen constitutional fraud in American history. A Potemkin presidency fronted by a failing puppet with staffers behind the scenes pulling the strings. This is not political hyperbole. The American people saw it with their own eyes during the June 2024 debate. Numerous times, Biden stood frozen behind the podium, mouth agape, eyes frozen and unblinking. When he did speak, his words were confused and disjointed. I said that night, this is the most consequential presidential debate in history because it will result in one of the two candidates being removed from the ballot. That was exactly right. And following that debate, the Democrats recognized the collapse. They pulled out their knives and took out President Biden like Caesar on the Ides of March. For all of their strutting about, protesting that they support democracy, not a one of them gave a damn about democracy when they pulled Biden off the ballot and dropped Kamala Harris in without a single Democrat primary voter voting for him. And you know what? Not a single Democrat is here today because not a single one of them gives a damn about the fact that they lied to the American people for 4 years. They knew. Every one of them knew that Joe Biden was mentally not competent to do the job. The White House press secretary, she knew when she stood in front of the American people and lied over and over and over again, and they're not here because they can't defend themselves. It wasn't a surprise. For 4 years, the White House hid President Biden from Republican senators, would not let him meet with us. He served 40 years in this body. We all know him. And they deliberately lied. And by the way, Jake Tapper had a bombshell book exposing the incredible scandal that Biden's mental decline was covered up by Jake Tapper. There's a Yiddish word, chutzpah. And that truly is chutzpah. How dare we lie and cover up what we all knew? Now, I have been asked literally 1,000 times by Texans, who was running the country? And I'm going to give you the most terrifying answer. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And not a single Democrat here cares. The most telling proof of Biden's decline came with the signature of the president, the symbol of executive authority that was outsourced to a machine. Mr. Wold, you're a lawyer who served in the White House counsel's office. You understand the gravity of presidential action. Does the president's signature carry legal and constitutional weight under Article 2?
Yes.
Is the act of signing an executive order or signing a law or granting a pardon a delegable duty of the president?
So in that opinion in 2005 from OLC, they said essentially that an auto pen could be used by a subordinate, but the president's determination as to sign the document can never be delegated.
Can that authority be transferred to a staffer or a machine without the president's explicit authorization?
Never.
And if you look at the statistics are stunning. In 2021, President Biden issued 78 executive orders. None were signed with an auto pen. That first year of the presidency, Biden, I suppose, was relatively lucid, and 78 executive orders he signed by hand. The second year, however, we see the auto pen emerge. The first auto pen executive order was issued on July 15th, 2022. After that day, 100% of the executive orders issued in 2022 were signed by an auto pen. In 2023, Biden issued 24 executive orders. 16 were auto penned. In 2024, Biden issued 19. 14 were auto-penned. In 2025, Biden issued 14 executive orders. Every single one was auto-penned. Mr. Wald, let me ask you as a legal matter, if there's a law that's passed both houses of Congress and it goes to the White House, and a staffer auto-pens signing that law without the president's authorization, is that law legally passed and signed into law?
No.
If an executive order is issued and a staffer auto-pens it without the president's authorization, is that executive order legally binding?
No.
And if a pardon is issued from the President of the United States and a staffer auto-pens it without the President's authorization, is that pardon legally binding?
No.
Under the Biden White House, the ceremonial song, Hail to the Chief, was effectively replaced with Hail to the Pen. And it was an outright assault on democracy. And every reporter covering this ought to ask, why doesn't a Democrat care? We heard about the moral responsibilities of a staffer. How about an elected senator who knows damn well that if we get into a war and Iran is preparing to fire a nuclear weapon at the United States, that the commander-in-chief is busy playing with his Jell-O and is not competent to defend ourselves? And every member of the cabinet, the chief of staff, the press secretary, and the members of Congress who lied about this on a daily basis with the press's complicity, they are all responsible for subverting democracy.
Senator Cornyn.
Professor Harrison, we've talked about the mechanics of the 25th Amendment whereby an incapacitated president would be removed. But it strikes me that ultimately it happened, albeit not before the end of President Biden's full term. What we saw happen after the disastrous debate in the summer of 2024 is basically an exercise of the powers of the 25th Amendment by the political elites in the Democratic Party to get President Biden not to run again and to substitute Kamala Harris for him as the Democratic nominee for president. So, Mr. Spicer, maybe the mechanics were a little bit different. Maybe the timing was not the same, but doesn't that demonstrate the capacity of the leadership of the Democratic Party, of the Biden family, of the senior staff and the president's administration to be able to convince the president that he no longer was capable of serving and needed to step down?
Senator, the left and their friends in the media like to throw around terms like threats to democracy, constitutional crisis. And if we don't have confidence in the leader of the free world making decisions, that truly is the definition of a constitutional crisis and the threat to democracy. So for all of these folks to stand up here and use those phrases over and over again and then not have the desire to show up, to understand what's happening, to stand up at the time, as we discussed earlier, whether it was a staffer or a cabinet member, to literally avoid going to the Oval Office. And in the case of the media, to avoid the questions that were so clearly obvious to the rest of America, shows that they were more concerned with power and preserving that power and an agenda than they were at really caring about the Constitution and democracy.
I agree that that is the clear conclusion. And obviously they decided to do it only at such a time as that ability to wield power was coming to an end. If, in fact, President Biden had remained the nominee of the Democratic Party and then ran against and lost to President Trump, these folks would be out of luck and out of power. So they decided to act under that circumstance.
Senator, you look at a lot of these decisions, and it was pretty clear that there was a handful of folks at the top of the Biden administration and Biden White House that had been around him for decades, where all of that information funneled. So I mentioned before, there are approximately 25 senior White House staffers that have the rank of assistant to the president. Those are the highest White House staffers. I would bet that only a handful of them ever interacted with President Biden on a daily basis. The rest of them had their communications funneled through other people. If the press secretary, the communications director, whose job it is to speak on behalf of the principal in lieu of them being able to talk or communicate, don't have access to those individuals at the senior most level, then what good are they? And I would argue that while many times we heard people in the press and on the left accuse the Trump White House of quote unquote lying, for them to go out there and talk about the president's stance on issues, what President Biden thought or didn't think on a personnel issue, a policy issue, when in fact they had never spoken to him, is in fact the epitome of lying.
One of the most consequential actions or inactions of the Biden presidency during 4 years was his failures to secure our southern border and to deal with illegal immigration. I have in my hand examples of the Biden immigration proclamations and executive orders, and there are a lot of them, as you know. They also include things like granting temporary protected status to large populations of immigrants, particularly from countries in Central America, rescinding Trump administration policies when it came to enforcing our laws at the border, granting parole, which is essentially a permission slip to enter the country in a way that would otherwise be illegal. And Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent that this document be made part of the record as an example of the sort of consequential border security and immigration-related measures that President Biden purported to sign.
Without objection. Mr. Wald, I do want to follow up on a couple of things with you and Mr. Harrison and also Mr. Spicer. Under the Presidential Powers Act, we could have a special access request, correct, to the archivist to find out what assent was actually given by Joe Biden on the auto pen. Is that your understanding?
If they kept records,
Right.
yes.
Right. Well, I think that will be something we will be pursuing. Professor Harrison, I wanted to ask you, sort of on the Article 1 branch's role, and I think I understand your concern when you say the president could do something. You're dealing with sort of a separation of powers issue is sort of what I'm reading into that. So the Article 1 branch can impeach for high crimes and misdemeanors. Should the Constitution be amended, in your view, to deal with this incapacitation? So impeachment would be a vehicle beyond just the 25th Amendment, but impeachment would be a vehicle to deal with these issues.
Senator, there's a long-standing question about whether impeachment is appropriate for inability. There's been questions right at the beginning of the Republic about a couple of judges who were in very poor shape. Not that they'd committed crimes; they were impeached and removed. And there were doubts as to whether impeachment was appropriate for that because there was problem. Their problem was age and inability. So you're absolutely right that there's a doubt right now whether the impeachment process, and it goes back a long, long way, whether the impeachment process is a way of dealing with inability as opposed to misconduct. It's clearly primarily directed at misconduct, and I think that if members of Congress are thinking about an additional constitutional amendment, and maybe they should be, they should think both about adapting the impeachment process to inability, which, as I say, right now it's not clear it's properly used in those situations, or creating yet some other political process to deal with presidential inability if lawmakers think that the political process that's in Sections 3 and 4 of the 25th Amendment is inadequate. The last thing I'll say, just as a policy matter, and this is not speaking on the legal question, I do think it's important that any decision about presidential inability remain something that's decided by politically accountable people, that it's treated as a political decision. It can't just be a technocratic decision.
Mr. Spicer, you've criticized the corporate media and legacy media folks for sort of lying down here or being complicit because of their, whether it's Trump derangement syndrome or whatever the reason was. They who specifically do you think gets a gold star for lying most profusely and just sort of continuing to cover this up over the years?
Sir, that would be like a photo finish. There'd be a lot that would probably right there at first place. They're all culpable. I mean, I read some of the headlines to the committee earlier, the Washington Post, CNN, NBC, where they, without evidence, to use their phrase, went after President Trump's physical and mental acuity, and yet failed to ask similar questions of the White House press office publicly. They failed to cover the stories. I don't think that there's a winner. I think they're all losers.
Thank you. And then we'll sort of wrap up here with Professor Harrison and Mr. Wold. So moving forward, we mentioned maybe possibly amending the Constitution or further exploring whether incapacitation is an impeachable, if impeachment's a remedy. What other, in your experience, what other things moving forward could be done to make sure that this scenario that we saw play out over the last 4 years never happens again?
Senator, I think the most important thing that can be done is something you're doing right now, which is draw public attention to this problem, and so give presidents an incentive to take steps that will reassure the people that they are sound and able to perform their functions.
Mr. Wall.
I would agree with the professor and just add that there should be some accountability for the staffers and the officers of the United States who acted to conceal and to cover up the president's incapacity from the American people. One other issue that's tied up in sort of this bundle of incapacity, impeachment, is also succession, and that's something so many have written about extensively over the years. We are very blessed that we have never had a double vacancy with the president and the vice president, either because of terror attack or misconduct. That's something that legal scholars have said for many decades, that Congress really has to work on that. And I would add, yes, in fact, that's something you all should take up with some seriousness.
May I say spontaneously, yes, please?
Okay. Well, I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony here today. Written questions for them may be submitted for the record until June 26th at 5 p.m. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.